If you are pregnant or you've recently had a baby, this podcast is for you. I am your host, Kath Bequee, a physiotherapist working in women's health and mum of 3. Join me each week as we dive into all things pregnancy care, childbirth and postnatal recovery, helping you have a wonderful pregnancy and afterbirth experience. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. Well, hi there. Welcome to episode 33 of the Fitness Mama podcast. Are you a bit scared about childbirth? Because I know I certainly was, especially for my first baby. In this episode, I talked to the amazing Hypnodoula Melissa about why we need to ditch the fear around childbirth and, more importantly, some strategies for how to do this. So stick around because it's a great episode. And before we do dive into this episode, if you would like to feel more empowered about your upcoming childbirth, join the Fitness Mama free 5-day challenge waitlist. So our next event is the start of June 2021, and we go through 5 days, 5 ways to help you prepare for childbirth. So in these 5 days, I walk you through strategies for perineal massage, active birth techniques, pushing techniques, and tips for afterbirth recovery. If this is of interest to you, register for our next event via fitnessmama.com/challenge. All right, let's get into this episode. Hello, Melissa. Thank you for joining me today. It's so lovely to have you on.
Hi, Kath. Thank you. I'm very excited to be here. It's taken us a bit to get it organised. I'm really excited to be here.
So for those who don't know you, could you please introduce yourself today?
So my name is Melissa, but you might have seen me around as Melissa Kate, and I am a childbirth educator. I do that work mostly through hypnobirthing. I deliver the hypnobirthing program, but I work with mums as a birth doula and in postnatal support as well. I had my children are 6 and 4, just turned 4. And when I had them, I just fell in love with pregnancy, not being pregnant, to be honest, but the whole process and how amazing it was, what our bodies do and what they can achieve. And I've got an exercise science background, so I've always loved the body, the way the human body functions, and sort of learning about pregnancy and birth was the next level for me. And I decided that this is where I want to spend my time. I want to work with other women and help share the joy that can be giving birth. And I know that's not everyone's experience, and that's okay. I just feel really passionate about helping women understand, because I know that knowledge is power and we can't control what our birth or our pregnancy experience is. But I know that if we have the information, if we understand what we're going through, it really can contribute to how we feel about our experience. So that's what I set out to achieve every day.
Beautiful. And that's partly what we're going to talk about today. Like with childbirth, I know often there's a lot of fear around childbirth and during childbirth. And I know I felt this especially during my first. Before we go on, could you explain, I guess, what a doula is and how a doula might help you? Because I know some doulas accompany you in birth, the actual birth, whereas other doulas don't. So could you just explain a little bit more about what a doula is?
Yeah, so I kind of describe it as a professional hand holder, which, maybe undersells it a little bit. But a doula is there for emotional support. So I'm not medically trained. I'm not there to give you medical advice or to speak on your behalf in your, medical conversations. I'm there to give you that emotional support, that self-belief, be the backup for your partner. There's so much pressure happens around, those final weeks of labour and that giving birth, and partners often feel so sort of uncertain about their role to play. I think 99% of them say, all I want to do is support my partner, but I don't know how to. So it's about sort of being there to kind of give them a little nudge and support you as a couple to get through. It's interesting because I love working with women in their births, and attending someone's birth is just the most magical and such an honour to be able to do that. But my goal really is to set you up before, so you don't need me there, so that you feel completely confident in your your knowledge and your body's ability and your partner's ability to support you so that you can take your birth on and just walk in there with absolute conviction. I tend to talk to women and say, look, love to be your birth, like biggest honor ever, but how about we get you prepped beforehand and then I spend some time with you once the baby arrives? Because I find often we drop off that cliff a little bit. We get all the support until baby comes. And then once baby's there, we kind of don't have as much support. So I feel that it's just as valuable, and if not more valuable, to be in that doula role, that support, emotional connection role postnatally.
I 100% agree with what you're saying, but like you're talking about it from a motherhood and the newborn perspective, which I 100% agree. We need so much more support. And then from my perspective, there's a lot of focus often on the pregnancy and childbirth, but that postnatal rehab, so helping your body recover after childbirth, is also, I find, tends to drop off. And I can understand why. Like, you've got a newborn and you're learning how to be a mum and change nappies and breastfeed and you're sleep deprived.
And, you know, it would fit perfectly from a physical recovery point of view. We say to our mums, the first 6 weeks, like, it's just about you and your bubble and going nowhere and just staying home and resting and recovering. But in our lives today, that's so impractical. You know, I say that to mums and think, oh, yeah. And I know what I was like. You know, I remember going out 6 days later, going for coffee with my baby and then getting home and feeling all that pelvic heaviness and just tired and baby's overwhelmed. And we're kind of our own worst enemies a lot of the time. But you don't know what you don't know. And that's what the message I'm trying to really get out there is preempt that. And once you're in that moment, it can be really hard to see the light. But if you can preempt and have that support, I always recommend have a lactation consultant on hand, have a women's health physio on hand, have your GP on hand, have these people you know that when it gets a bit tough, you can call. You don't want to be searching for a good lactation consultant when you're in the midst of having feeding troubles. So it's that preparation, preparing for your birth, but preparing for your postnatal time is so important as well.
As I said at the start, we're going to talk about, I guess, the role of fear. I want to talk about why women are often fearful, and then what does fear potentially do to your childbirth, and then what are some strategies to help overcome that fear. So let's start at the start. So I can understand why women might be fearful, but what do you find are the main reasons why women are perhaps a little bit fearful about childbirth?
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes into a lot of people's mind is, oh my gosh, how's this going to come out? Like, this baby's got to come out. And that just feels really confronting, that we have a visual of what size the baby is and a visual of the space that they need to move through. And that just physiologically, we just can't make that connect. So I think for a lot of people it's that. And then it is the fear of the unknown. Like, what do I do next? Where do I go? Where do I get the information? How do I know I'm making the right decisions? What if something goes wrong? How will I know if something's going wrong? It's just that unknown of what's to come. And that can be, whether it's birth or a brand new job or moving house, anything. If you don't know what's to come, it can be really nerve-wracking. And that sort of feeds back into the history of birth and our education around birth. We don't talk about birth, not until you're in that sphere do you have any idea about the healthcare system around birth or the physicality of birth, or it's just not taught. So I think that's a real sort of concern, I guess. I can't change the education system, but it's one of those things. And because of that, we then have this preconceived idea of what birth is going to be. So it's that fear around the pain, and that we view birth as something that we have to endure, something we have to suffer through. And, it's all worth it in the end because I have my baby, but I just have to push through, because we have all these preconceived images of birth. Most people's experience of birth is a Hollywood movie or is a TV show, or, One Born Every Minute's an interesting show, but that's not necessarily the best insight either. From a very young age, I don't know about your kids, I'm sure they love Bluey. Like, Bluey's the best cartoon going around. But there's an episode where Dad pretends to have a baby up his top and he screams and yells as he delivers the baby. So from 3-4 years old, we're being told that birth is this painful, scary thing that you have to endure. So it's nobody's fault. We have these preconceptions. So I think for most of us, it's that the fear of the pain and the fear of the unknown that all the women I speak to, that's where they are starting.
This episode is brought to you by Baby Bee, Australian-owned and designed prams combining quality, safety and style. Not only does Baby Bee let you try their prams at home with free returns for 9 months. Yes, that's 9 months. They also offer an industry-leading 3-year warranty for total peace of mind. With thousands of 5-star reviews, around-the-clock customer care, and up to $300 of free accessories with every pram, what are you waiting for? Go visit www.babybeeonline.com and check them out for yourself. And yes, for listeners of the podcast, there is a 20% discount code. Enter FITBEE, FITBEE 20 at checkout, and T's and C's apply. And they're two big topics, aren't they? Fear of pain and fear of the unknown. Where do we start?
Yeah. I think the unknown's an interesting one because that's one you can control to a degree. Nobody can predict your birth, no matter how of a skilled care provider you are or healthcare professional. No one can predict what your birth is going to be. But understanding the physiology of birth, for instance, it's a bit cheesy, but we call them the gifts from nature. So talking about how your perineum is designed to stretch, talking about how your pelvis shape changes, talking about relaxin flowing through your body, talking about your natural expulsive reflex, which is your body's natural ability to effectively squeeze baby out. We know women in comas can give birth because of this response. So I think it's learning about these things and going, oh yeah, okay, my body's going to work with me. It's not my pre-pregnancy body squeezing baby out. There's all these things that will happen to align to help the process easier. Another great one is the fontanelles, the molding of baby skulls. Babies' skulls change shape. So they're not, that full circumference that you might imagine or that you see in the ultrasound. That's not necessarily exactly the size and shape that's moving through the birth canal. So I think learning about those things and reinstilling some confidence that your body knows what to do, that your body is programmed to adapt and change to make this happen. And then we talk about navigating the healthcare system. And that's, not in any way downplaying, care providers. It's about understanding what the system looks like so that you know what to expect, you know what to anticipate, you know what the standard treatments are, the standard processes and policies, so that when you're 40 weeks and you hear that you're getting induced next week and this is how we're going to induce you, it's not the first time you've heard those terms. You understand what your options are and you can have an educated conversation with your care provider. And I think that knowledge and empowerment can really help reduce your fear levels on the unknown sense.
And I have to admit, with my first baby 8 years ago, I put my head in the sand. I thought, you know what, it'll be fine. I'm a bit of that sort of relaxed sort of attitude. It'll be fine. And then as the time crept closer, I suddenly thought, oh, I haven't done anything to prepare. Oh my gosh. But by then it was too late.
And it's a really fine line, and I have that conversation regularly about the head in the sand versus the overstressing you out because you've read every single book that exists. And, how do you know when you're on that line is a really tough thing. I think the best thing is to find a connection with, it can be someone like myself who is a birth educator, but it can be your GP, it can be your physio, it can be your mum, your sister-in-law, anyone who has some experience that can help guide you with some questions you might have. And it's not about becoming an obstetrician, like completely specializing in birth. It's just knowing the basics, knowing physically what happens to your body and what are the most common things that pop up in hospital or wherever you choose to birth. And then at least you've heard those terms before. And then when someone says we're going to augment your birth, you're like, what does augmentation mean? Which means speeding up labor artificially. But knowing that, it just takes that fear out of the situation. So for everyone, I always say the biggest thing you can do to impact your birth positively is to sort of commit. I mean, everyone's committed to their pregnancy, but research, watch some videos, read some books, read some articles, and learn like you would. You wouldn't go and buy a house without doing some research. So, it's to say, don't give birth without doing a little bit of research. So that's kind of my point of view on it anyway.
Absolutely. And my second and third births were much nicer experiences once I, put on my big girl pants and decided to learn a bit more about it. And I teach I've got a challenge, 5 days, free challenge, 5 days, 5 ways to prepare for labour. And we're talking about the physical side of things, like the active birth techniques and the perineal massage. And yeah, it can be really empowering. I know that firsthand and from so much feedback. So it's amazing. Okay, so we've talked about some reasons why women might be fearful of birth. What does fear do physiologically to the body? Like, why don't we want to be fearful of birth?
Yeah, and this is really interesting, and I love sharing this with people because so often they're like, oh my gosh, yeah, that's so obvious. It's like, cool, now I know that. So most people have probably heard of your flight or fight response. It's a pretty common term that for most people over your life, you might have heard at some point. Effectively, it's our human survival response. So it goes right back to, the days when we lived, caveman days, and we needed to be able to have this response when we were in danger. So if we felt we were in danger, our bodies could automatically flip into this mode where we could either fight for our lives or flee. And what happens physiologically when you go into that fight or flight response is that adrenaline and catecholamines are released, amongst other things, but they're the key things we talk about in birthing. They are released, and what they do is they get your heart beating faster, which is great because that gets more oxygenated blood moving to your body. The response promotes the flow of the blood to your survival muscles, so your arms or your legs. It says, okay, this is what we want to do right now. So let's get all the oxygen as much as we can to your arms and your legs so we can fight or flee. And that's brilliant. That's a really great response. If there's something wrong, we can get away. The downside in labour of that, though, is if you think about where all the work's happening in labour, and it's in your uterus, and you think about what else is in the uterus is your placenta, and that is giving oxygen to your baby. So when you're in flight or fight, your internal core muscles aren't part of the survival muscles. So they kind of get neglected, which means the blood flow gets lessened, which in turn means the oxygen gets lessened. And in essence, that means your baby's getting less oxygen. And your uterus can't function as efficiently and as effectively, the muscle reaction, as it needs to. So when we're in that fight or flight, it's not great for the physical response for the baby. But what it also does is it blocks the key hormones that we need to give birth. So catecholamines are a blocker essentially for endorphins, which are a natural tranquilizer, and can inhibit the release of oxytocin. And oxytocin is the neuropeptide which we produce that is responsible for surging the uterus. So if you're in your fight or flight response, you're really inhibiting your ability to birth from a hormonal and a physical point of view. And so for most people, once you understand that, you think, oh, okay, cool. Well, I definitely don't want to be in fight or flight. But then you've got to work out, well, how do I not go into that fight or flight? Well, that's a whole hypnobirthing course for you.
Now, episode 12 was with the lovely Loretta Hamilton. So if you're interested in all this, go and check out episode 12 because she described how if a dog is going to give birth, it will not give birth when it's in a light environment, noisy, people running around. What it does is goes to the dark closet, somewhere dark where it can relax and therefore give birth. And I love that analogy because like when we're in the flight or fight response, I assume it slows down labour dramatically, the natural progression of labour. So thinking, where would an animal naturally want to give birth? And it's exactly right, isn't it? It's a quiet environment, it's dark, it's relaxing, and where they feel really safe.
Yep, we talk about private, safe, and unobserved. You need to feel private, you need to feel safe, and you need to feel unobserved to give birth. And the example actually in the hypnobirthing textbook is a cat giving birth to kittens, but same thing. That was a real core of Marie Mongan, who wrote the program. She witnessed that, and that was sort of started getting her to think about the whole thing. But I talk to my couples about I think of it as like a little snow globe. Create your little bubble, your little birthing bubble that you feel completely private, safe, and unobserved in. And at home, that can often be reasonably easy. You might go into the nursery. You might decide, I want to labour at home in the nursery because that gives me all these beautiful feelings and I feel really calm and excited and positive about this experience that's happening. You might have low lights and music and fairy lights, all those kind of things happening. And then when you need to move to the hospital, if you're birthing in a hospital, okay, we've got to get in the car. So how can we create that environment in the car? And we talk about your senses. So what can you hear? What can you smell? What can you see? What can you feel? Taste is probably less relevant. And so then you bring your eye mask, your essential oils, your beautiful blanket that makes you feel good. You create that bubble and you travel it to the car. And then when you get to the car, you've got to the hospital. So then you try and create that bubble as much as you can in the hospital. And, there's practical things that get in the way along the journey. But if you can, in essence, try and create that beautiful, safe, private, unobserved environment, you're in a lot better position.
I love that. I've heard it talked a lot about at home and in a hospital, but that transition in the car, that's awesome. And I distinctly remember for my first birth getting into the car, and then like there were a couple of ambulances that went past, high noise, lights flashing. So yeah, I distinctly remember that. Totally took me out of my zone.
Well, that's right. Imagine pulling up next to a bus and you're like, oh my gosh, this busload of people are looking in my window. Yeah, that's it. So I think an eye mask is 101. You must have an eye mask on and listening to your music. If you've got a blanket, or I'm a very tactile person, like I'm that person that walks in the shop and touches every piece of clothing. If you're a tactile person, have a blanket that you can wrap yourself in and touch and rub, or a piece of baby's clothing that you love. Just things that make you feel good, because the feel good hormones are the hormones that are responsible for labor. So as much as possible, you just want to be in that. We talk about fight or flight versus your neutral state, your calm zone. We want to stay in that calm zone as much as possible.
Would you say that would be one sort of massive strategy? Create your snow globe.
Yes.
we were talking about the physiological side of the fight and flight, so that sort of went on a tangent. Yeah.
Sorry.
No,
I do
it's
that.
great. I love it. Going back to why don't we want fear? Like, what does it do to labour? Was that the main one, or was there anything else you wanted to tick off?
The core thing is that fight or flight response. And from that fight or flight response, it sets off so many reactions internally, from tension to lack of oxygen to lack of the birthing hormones flowing. So it's really the overarching umbrella of things. And then the key is to work out some strategies to stay out of that zone. And the thing that's really interesting is that our bodies don't understand. They can't tell the difference between an actual threat or a perceived threat. So if you think about walking to your car at night and whether there's somebody there or not, sometimes you get that goosebumps and you think, oh my God, they could be, like, I just feel really uncomfortable. That is, you're going into fight or flight, and it's a perceived threat. There's not actually a threat there. Or someone slams the door and you jump and you sort of feel your heart rate go. That's a perceived threat. And so that's really interesting to note when you think about birthing and you think about hospitals and you think about people in your space that don't make you feel comfortable. So you might be under no threat whatsoever, but the person who's in that room might make you feel uncomfortable, might just have a look about them, might have a sound about them, just something that doesn't make you feel comfortable. That can send you into that fight or flight mode. If you're birthing in a hospital where you've had previous negative experiences, either you or somebody you care about, you might find that the minute you walk into that space, you have this uncontrollable, you go into the fight or flight response because you're like, last time I was here, I remember something horrible happening. So it's that perceived versus real fear is really interesting. So that's when we talk about, think about and plan about where you're birthing, who's going to be involved in your environment. I don't know, even just down to, we're talking about the car ride. If you get really angsty when your partner drives you, or, you don't like traveling, or if there's something that sets you off normally every day, you have to try and pick those things out and avoid them during labour. I remember I actually said to my husband, I didn't go into labour this time, but we thought I was. And we drove, it was like midnight. I'm like, can I just drive myself? Like, I just feel like I need to be in control. And that was, at the time, I didn't know necessarily what I know now, but I just knew that I would be the worst passenger. And I wasn't in pain. It was just that my waters had broken. So I was like, I'd like to drive, please. and it just gave me that sense of control. So yeah, I mean, there's probably not a lot of labouring women who want to drive themselves to hospital. But yeah, it's just reading your room and thinking about what the room might be and how you can add things to it to make it a positive experience.
I distinctly remember our drive we were living close to the MCG. So if you're in Melbourne, that's like the main football stadium, and I was due on grand final day.
Oh no.
And I was having pictures of being bumper to bumper. Like there was one road to pretty much get to the hospital, and I was just, for ages, that was creating such angst too.
Yeah.
And yeah, it probably wasn't very helpful having that concern. I probably should have changed, knowing that I was due on grand final day. I guess people probably come across this all the time if you live rurally or regionally and it's a long drive to the hospital. Like there'd be lots of situations where that's a concern.
It's interesting because we talk, and you hear a lot of talk about, you want to birth at home for as long as possible and the reason for that is private, safe and unobserved. You're in your own space. You're more likely to feel in that calm environment. But I do say to people, that's not true for everybody. If you live far away or you have particular anxiety around medical issues, or for some people, getting to the hospital sooner rather than later actually helps them feel calmer. So I think you need to take every piece of advice with a grain of salt and then apply your, experience on top of that.
Yeah, I love that point that you just made then, for not for everyone staying at home as long as possible. Yeah, so have a chat to your hospital, and yeah, that's brilliant.
And that's sort of my philosophy, because I know I found not so much in birth, but in early pregnancy, I spent the entire time trying to tick all the boxes. Like I remember asking on day one, like, can I pick her up? Because I wasn't sure if I was allowed to pick the baby up from the cot because she'd been wrapped up and put down. And I spent the whole time worrying about what I can and can't do. And then when I had my second, there's just no time for that. You just you've got the confidence, but also you've just got to get on with it, because I had a toddler. And it was so liberating, feeling like, oh yeah, I'm in charge here. And so I really love to speak to all the mums I work with and say, look, if you come to me and you want to have a pre-planned cesarean, I will support you. All I want you to know is the facts and that you make an educated decision, and anywhere in between. But I just think it's really important that you make a decision that's right for you with the right information, not just because a friend did it. That doesn't mean it's the best option for you. So I think that helps with that fear factor, because once you learn about things, what you think you might be afraid of, once you learn, you're like, oh, right. I was speaking to someone yesterday who was not wanting a particular procedure. And once I explained it to her, she was like, oh, well, I'm cool with that.
Well, you gave us some amazing little strategies and techniques to try there to help reduce the fear. And my biggest takeaway was create your little, what did you call it? A snow bubble?
Snow globe.
Snow globe.
Yeah, little bubble or snow globe. I just picture it in my head as a snow globe.
Yeah, I love it. So thank you very much, Melissa. For those who would like to learn more about you and your services, how can people contact you?
Yeah, sure. So my website is melissakate.com.au, or Instagram's where I'm probably the most active, and it's melissakate_hypnodoula. I'm trying my best with reels, so get on board and check out some of my silly videos I'm putting out there.
You've done some great reels. I love it. And for anyone who listened to this episode, send Melissa and me a message on Instagram. We would love to hear from you. Thank you so much, Melissa, for joining me today.
Thank you, Kath, for having me. It's my absolute pleasure.
Amazing. Speak to you soon. Before I sign off, remember my team and I will be putting together the show notes for this episode with all the links at fitnessmama.com/podcast, including how to connect with Melissa Kate and also how to join the challenge for the free 5-day event coming up in June. 5 days, 5 ways to prepare for labour. I'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this episode, it would be amazing if you could give it a quick rating and review. It really helps with the algorithm and it helps this podcast get found by more women just like you. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a fabulous day, and I look forward to you joining me next week for another episode of the Fitness Mama podcast.